I wanted to take a few minutes to give you a kind of an overview of Chapter 8 for this 8th week in the semester. And this chapter deals with intimate relationships, sex, love, and commitment. So the whole chapter's, I think, crux sort of revolves around this idea of a particular nature of human beings. Social psychology have said this about us all along, and that is that we are pro-social creatures. So, I mean, even if you're an introvert and you get energy from a fewer number of people, you probably at least have one best friend, right? So there's always this tendency we have to gravitate toward members of our species, okay? And so certainly sexuality, romance, those two things have something to do with that feeling of being pro-social. Pro-social also heightens a construct in psychology that we call PWV, which is an abbreviation for psychological well-being. There was a bit of research that indicates that in surveys we've discovered that when we lose partners, whether it's through an ugly divorce or death, that partners tend to die sooner. So this ability to commit, to be engaged in a relationship for a span of time, then we even see it's correlated with like onset of psychological illnesses as well as physical illnesses. With that said, though, we have 27% of the population who identify as singles. And there is something called singleism, which refers to the prejudice or bias that society tends to have against singles. If you're single, you may have heard pressing questions from friends or relatives who want to know when you're going to find that special one, or are you dating somebody? The implication being that it's not normal not to be involved with somebody romantically. So Miller calls this a deficit identity is what singlehood is. All right. So on page 206, though, I'm directing you to that page specifically because with that said, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, there should be no biases against singlehood. There are some downsides to remaining single for extended periods of time, and you can find those on 206. He also alludes to the hookup culture, which I think may be a little misdirected as far as we as human beings are concerned in the 21st century, because usually hookup culture is a term that refers a lot to your age group, to a population that you're a member of, to college students, in other words. And as we look at statistics, we discover that actually hookups are on the decrease, that college students are endorsing having less sex now and fewer sexual partners in college than in generations before them. Then from there he moves into friends with benefits. We find that there's a difference in the way men and women perceive friends with benefits. Men, for example, see having friends with benefits as the objective. Okay, they don't perceive it going any farther than that, whereas women tend to see, well, this is just a stepping stone for perhaps a romantic relationship. Then we get into definitions of love, and there are a couple of those that he mentions, one of which is Bob Sternberg's conceptualization of it. So he says that there are 3 stages of romantic love, starting with passionate love, right? So passionate love would be involved with where you feel maybe anxious when you're separated from the person that you're seeing. You get the jitters when you're anticipating them coming over. Are you going to see them, right? So, in fact, this has led some of my more cynical psychology colleagues into wondering, maybe we should get passionate love, the classification of being a psychological disorder. Maybe we should need to put it in the diagnostic and statistical manual. But, hopefully they're saying that tongue-in-cheek, because this is a very temporary condition that really doesn't need treatment, generally speaking. And so basically that happens on a very temporary basis. Now, if a relationship is to last, then you got to move beyond that, because the sexual excitement which is what a lot of this revolves around, begins to dissipate a little bit as time goes on. So then you move from passionate love into companionate love. That doesn't say we exclude, nor should we, the passionate component of it, but then it's like we get to know that individual that we've been drawn toward almost magnetically or electrically. We begin to appreciate that individual more as a human being. And then if we are lucky enough to move in our relationship with that individual to consummate love, that means that all of these things are all mixed together. This attraction and the friendship, all of that goes into the commitment pot. Then we have John Lee's styles of loving. There's 6 styles, he says, on page 211, and that gets a little more detail than I'd like to go into on this jump right in video, but you can find a questionnaire based on John Lee's styles of loving on page 213, so I encourage you to take it to see where you stand on that questionnaire. Then the chapter moves into the idea of commitment. There are a couple of models that Lay-Miller gives us. The investment model is the first one, and that's the one that I can wrap my head more easily around, I think. So basically the investment model means I am more prone to commit myself romantically and companionately and consummately to someone if certain conditions are met. Am I satisfied with the relationship with that individual? Okay? And what do we mean by satisfaction? Well, there probably was a time when you looked at other alternatives. You've dated other people perhaps, or there are other people in your social circle that you've considered as possible romantic individuals, and you finally, romantic partners, and you finally settled upon the person that you're involved with now as being the highest quality of those individuals. And then finally, investment for that satisfaction, that relationship to continue to grow, there must be an investment, a mutual investment, where you give and there's a kind of equal give and take to the relationship and to the quality of the relationship. In terms of the way we commit to each other, there is, by the way, very little difference between same-sex relationships as opposed to heterosexual relationships. The only thing this, I'm afraid, is probably older research that we probably need to see if we can replicate, and I suspect it wouldn't be. But we find out that same-sex couples tend to break up a little more often than straight couples do. But that research tends to come from pre-2015, when nationwide marriage equality was established. So gay and lesbian couples couldn't get married before the Supreme Court made its decision. And so when you were comparing these relationships, we really weren't on an equal playing field as far as sexual orientation was concerned. So I think it's probably time to start seeing what happens when we do these kinds of research projects now. He also spends a little time on open relationships, polyamorous relationships, and also monogamous relationships. You can find a lot about that on page 217. He mentions the Coolidge effect. That's on page 218. The Coolidge effect, it merely states that after you've been sexually intimate with someone over a period of time, then after a while it's like, okay, your body and his or her body gets accustomed to the stimulation that you give each other, and so after a while the interest begins to peter out. Okay, so but that has to do just as much with neuroscience as it does with sexology, because the nature of the brain, there are two big characteristics of the brain that I think we need to reemphasize here, and that is the brain craves patterns, okay, and structure, and the brain also craves change and novelty. And so basically what happens with those couples who are successful in their committed relationships is that they are willing to explore different ways of pleasing each other in the bedroom and so forth. He also talks about marriage versus cohabitation. Cohabitation being the term that we used to call shacking up when I was in undergraduate school many years ago. And so basically the one negative thing we find out about cohabitation when we compare it to marriage is that if somebody who has been shacking up, if a couple that's been shacking up decide to tie the marital knot, that their marriage satisfaction tends to be less than those married couples who got married without living together first. However, here's the positive thing. If there's a couple who's cohabiting, that essentially we find out that the couples in both cohabitating relationships as well as marital relationships, that their health, both psychologically and physically, are better. So there's no difference that we find there. 221, that page, you will find some information about communication style. It is my contention, after doing therapy with a number of people who were having romantic relationships in my externship experience, is that bad communication is a lot of times the culprit in terms of committed relationships going down the toilet. That we need to learn how to fight so that we don't do so much damage to each other in the middle of those fights. We need to learn how to assertively, not aggressively, express our perspectives. We need to be able to keep positive communication even when we're talking about negatively perceived subjects. Okay, another theory in terms of getting commitment to last is this self-expansion theory, and that has to do with the idea that a committed couple can make that commitment last longer when they are both engaged in growing the relationship. I know some couples who grow the relationship because they're in businesses together, right? Or maybe they want to establish a nice home and a nice backyard, together, and they share a common vision in how they want to approach that. So basically, it's like come up with some common goals, some common projects, some common objectives. That helps as well. We also find that those individuals who experience marginalization in society as a couple, that their relationships are harder to maintain. And that used to be true of same-sex relationships because, in the 1950s particularly, it would be very difficult to find gay male couples because the marginalization was just incredibly intense. Lesbian couples, it was hard to find those, but it was a little less so because the stigma wasn't quite as nasty there as it was with males. But basically, it's hard to establish that commitment and that longevity to your relationship if you know that once you step out the front door of your house, that all you're going to meet is disapproval and condemnation. Then Miller gets into this idea of whether human beings are meant to be monogamous or not. And I'm afraid to argue one way or the other is to miss the point. I think that what is natural for human beings really is painted by the idiographic nature of what we find in research, and that is that each person has his or her own individual preferences. So if you are an individual who cherishes monogamy, that is part of your sexual values, then you sure as hell need to find somebody else who is not into polyamory or non-monogamy. You need to get somebody who is not into that, right? Or you're headed very quickly, your relationship is headed very quickly down the toilet, all right? So it's basically, making sure you match your attitude toward monogamy or non-monogamy with your partner. And then finally, the last page, actually about half a page, Miller devotes a few paragraphs to breakups and how to deal with that. So if you have ever been in a situation of breaking up with a romantic partner, then I think he mentions a couple of things that are not as healthy as others, but I think the biggest thing is pursue the aftermath of the breakup as an opportunity for personal growth when you change your mindset to that kind of opportunity, to like, okay, who am I now, as a person? What can I become? What are my what are the opportunities I have before me, then you are a lot more likely to end up on the other side of that breakup in a healthier place. So enjoy the chapter, and we'll touch base again soon. Get in touch with me if you have any questions.